34-year-old Paige Birgfeld was a mom whose whole life revolved around her kids. And when days passed with no sign of her, some mysterious clues started popping up that would turn the whole case on its head. Paige was living a double life unknown even to the people closest to her. Paige was a single mom and had become the sole caregiver for her kids. When Paige seemingly vanished into thin air, the police knew she did not leave on her own terms. And the authorities started the investigation the usual way, by first looking at the people closest to Paige. Well, naturally, a history of divorce the year before piqued their interest. But when they learned that she had not one, but two ex-husbands, they started to get curious. So her first husband was her high school sweetheart, I guess, and the guy's name is Ron Bagler. According to Paige's dad, Ron was Paige's first big love, and they'd actually reconnected recently and started dating again in the past few months. According to Paige's sister-in-law, Allie, Paige was super stoked about rekindling the romance nearly 10 years later. Ron Bagler became the main focus of the investigation, especially when they learned that he had been with Paige the day she went missing. Well, apparently they'd been on a picnic date at a rest stop that was right around the halfway point between their homes since they lived 4 hours away from each other. But the things we do for love, am I right? Well, Paige drove home later that night around 9 o'clock, and Ron said they chatted on the phone for a little, and she told him she'd call him tomorrow. No, you hang up first. No, you hang up first. Cell phone records confirmed that Paige did call Ron around 9 p.m., and her location showed that she was only a few miles away from her home. Little did she know that this phone call would be one of her last. Paige, of course, would never call him back. She was only a few miles away from her home where her kids were waiting for her. She was so close. So Ron tried calling Paige the next day, but it went straight to her voicemail. So either the phone had turned off or the battery had died. 2 days after he'd last heard from Paige, Ron finally tried calling her home phone. Paige's live-in nanny, who was also taking care of her 3 children, told Ron that Paige hadn't been home since Thursday night, the night of their date. After that, he called the sheriff's office and then Paige's parents. Ironically though, Ron would become the first person that the police wanted to question. Although Ron was the last person to see and speak with Paige, everyone who knew him believed he had nothing to do with her disappearance. They were really adamant that he'd be the last person who'd want to harm her. And on top of that, he was also having a really hard time emotionally coping. So there was reason to suspect he was telling the truth. Paige's family said when they spoke to Ron on the phone, he sounded absolutely beside himself with grief, and he couldn't get through a sentence without choking up with tears, so they believed him. I mean, they have known the guy technically since he was in high school, so he'd probably have to be a pretty good actor to be fooling everyone if he was guilty. So after determining Ron's innocence, the investigators started going down a different path, which led them to suspect number 2. When asked if anyone might have wanted to harm Paige, her friends said yes, Rob Dixon, her second husband and the father of her children. So just to clarify, we have Ron Bagler, Paige's first husband and most recent boyfriend, and Rob Dixon, Paige's second husband and now ex. Well, apparently Rob had quite the history with Paige. Some described their relationship as explosive and troubled, which is 2007 speak for what we call toxic. While the police started looking into Rob, Paige's family knew they were losing time, and they had to just start looking somewhere if they ever wanted to find her. So they decided to split up in different directions to cover more ground. Anyway, a bunch of volunteers gathered to search as well, and Frank became the leader of the group, reminding everyone to keep their eyes open for anything. The investigation into Paige's past by the police pressed on, while the massive manhunt maneuvered its way through the mainland. Specialty divers combed through the mud in the murky river and found nothing. Finally, they got their first big lead on Sunday, July 1st, around 10 p.m. when a 911 call came in from a woman reporting that she saw a car on fire in a parking lot. Well, it turned out to be Paige's car, the one she drove on the night she vanished. Paige's red Ford Focus that was only 2 miles away from her home had completely burnt to a crisp in an empty parking lot. So by the next morning, they'd already been able to figure out that the fire was started from inside the car on the passenger side seat. To the investigators, this meant that whoever started the fire was smart enough to completely destroy any potential evidence inside the car that could lead to him. But the perp did make one mistake. When the car was found, the driver's seat had been pushed all the way back, which told them that someone very tall had probably driven the car, at least over 6 feet tall. While the Birgfeld family was terrified about what the car meant for the fate of Paige, the police continued zeroing in on their second suspect. The investigators had learned a few things about her history with her second husband, Rob Dixon. So back in 1997, when Paige met Rob, he was apparently a total catch. He and his dad had invested into a business venture that ended up becoming a huge success, and this caused their family to become very wealthy, which some people say changed Rob as a person. So Paige and Rob began a whirlwind relationship that moved lightning fast. And only a year after they met, they had a wedding and started their family together. I mean, that is fast. The family moved to Grand Junction into a house that they were able to do some renovations on, and they did their best to make it a home. But apparently, Dixon lived a very expensive lifestyle from his one-time financial success and hadn't learned how to responsibly handle his money. His funds were starting to dry out, and he began investing his remaining finances in more reckless investments. So he starts investing millions of dollars into these business ideas that were really risky, and the bills were piling up. Paige started to get really stressed out about them being able to provide for their kids, so she pitched in as best as she could. She started this adorable little preschool dance business where she'd teach classes and hold recitals that she'd even hand make the costumes for. Well, when that wasn't enough, she turned to what most middle-aged housewives do: sell for a multi-level marketing company. Which particular flavor of poison did she pick? Pampered Chef. But Paige, who wouldn't give up on wanting a good life for her kids, became one of the few successful sales agents of the company and earned a free trip to the Caribbean. Even still, Rob was apparently losing money way faster than Paige was making it, and within a few years, all of his investments had fallen through, and he'd pretty much lost everything. Paige's brother Craig said their financial struggles put a ton of pressure on their relationship, and it really caused some problems in their marriage, which at this point had taken a turn for the worse. Paige's family had also found these online message boards where Paige would write entries about her husband, sometimes almost like a journal, and the tea was piping hot. She wrote entries that talked about fearing for her life and her children asking if their dad was going to hurt her. This was only 3 months before she disappeared. Then police found out that in October of 2004, Paige called 911 for help after a nasty fight with Rob. She said that her husband threatened the lives of her children, and he said that she'd come home to find their bodies. I mean, what the hell is going on? That is really concerning. Well, the situation diffused by the time the police and media arrived, but no charges were filed. The couple divorced in 2006, and Rob declared bankruptcy and was living in Philadelphia, which is exactly where he said he was the night Paige disappeared, in Philadelphia, 2,000 miles away. I mean, wait, what? He was really starting to sound like our guy. But investigators concluded that Rob's alibi held up, so the family had to believe he was where he said he was that night. So now what? Well, after a few weeks had passed, some search volunteers found some of Paige's personal things, including her checkbook, scattered along the highway 15 miles from where the flaming car was discovered. And soon after, the police found some shocking information on Paige's computer and day planner that would turn her family's world upside down. Paige had been living a double life as an adult. She'd kept this entire part of her life a secret from every single person she knew, including her family, and they were all completely shocked. In provocative ads on the internet as a high-priced named Carrie. This was the point in the investigation where everything changed. You got that right. Paige's family was distraught to learn about her secret life and could hardly believe what they were seeing. But they were certain the only reason she'd turned to this profession was for her children. She had 3 kids, and the pressure of being the perfect mom and having to be the breadstick winner, I mean, that's a lot. I don't know how these single moms do it. Also, her husband only paid her $500 a month in child support, but her mortgage was like $6,000 a month. Her brother said it never really did make sense to him how Paige was able to afford her mortgage for more than a couple of months, but now it all clicked. At that point, the investigators had a hunch that Paige met her fatal end at the hands of one of her clients. So they searched Paige's phone and finally caught a lucky break. On the day she went missing, the last call she made was to Ron around 9 p.m., but she also had received several calls from a client of Inc. 3 calls had come in from a guy who called himself Jim, and asked if Carrie was available that evening, and then he called again that night. All the calls were made from a prepaid track phone, so police traced the number to a Walmart where it had been bought 2 days earlier by a man captured on candid camera. Ashton Kutcher, yo, come out here, you big kook, okay? The detectives were finally able to find out that Jim was this guy named Lester Jones. And Lester Jones just so happened to work right across the street from where Paige's burning car was found. Ugh. I mean, the name just gives me the shivers, Lester Jones. The track phone's entire history consisted of only 5 calls. The first 4 were him calling Paige on the Inc. line. Then Paige called the track phone back that night from her Inc. phone. After that, the track phone's battery died and never made another call again. Good. Lay that thing to rest, just chuck it in the sea. When they do a little digging, they find out that Jones had some jail time under his belt for lewd actions and that he was 6'5", the kind of guy who would drive with a car seat pushed all the way back. While one detective grilled Lester in the interrogation room, some police officers searched his workplace, while a few others had a little chat with his wife. Wait, wife? You mean to tell me this was able to lock down a honey? Oh, no. I don't think so. Apparently, Lester's wife was out of town the night Paige went missing, and the night when Paige's car was found burning, Lester confessed that he had left the house Sunday night between 9 and 10 p.m. for a thing at work. Wait, so you're telling me that Lester suddenly has a work thing the same time the Ford Focus is found burning up like a Jonas brother? Yeah, I don't think so. Speaking of his work, they searched the RV shop where he worked and found some dirty laundry. There were a bunch of handwritten notes about other sports in the area and intimate details about them down to their measurements, what their hair color was, and what they would and wouldn't do. Oh, Lester, you're such a Oh, and they also found the track phone packaging for the phone he bought, as well as a food scale from the good old pampered chef tucked away in his office. Yeah, I don't really get the feeling that Lester was using that scale to measure fruits and veggies, right? But Lester continued to deny any involvement in Paige's disappearance, and even went so far as to say it's not him in the surveillance video buying the phone in his second interrogation. He first denied being at the Walmart at all, and then said he went in there to buy a soda. Well, then tracker dogs were taken to Paige's car, and they signaled that they pick up the scent of Lester Jones in the front seat. But Lester said he'd never been anywhere with her. But just because there was all this evidence didn't mean it was proof. Could they prove without a doubt that Lester Jones was responsible for Paige Birgfeld's disappearance? Only one key piece of evidence was left that would allow convicted felon Lester Jones to remain free. They couldn't find a body. But 4 years later, in the spring of 2012, a hiker stumbled upon some skeletal remains in the dry creek bed 60 miles south of where Paige's personal things had been found scattered along the highway. Across the mile-long stretch of the creek, forensic scientists found more bones that they quickly determined belonged to Paige Birgfeld. They could piece together through the evidence that Paige had been taken against her will, and that Lester Jones is the only person who could have done it because of his history of assault, his shoddy alibi, his history with Paige as a client, the calls on his burner phone, and his work location being across the street from where the car was found. After years of not knowing, Paige's family finally had some answers. But in September 2016, Lester caught a break when the jury couldn't reach a verdict, so the case had to be retried. And in November of 2016, after 5 long, brutal weeks, the moment Paige's family had been waiting 9.5 years for finally happened. Lester Jones was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. Dang, 9.5 years with no answers. This one is such a wild story to think that someone can actually successfully live a double life without even their closest friends knowing is an impressive feat. But through all of these stories, we find out that apparently people get away with it all the time. It's just so sad to me that Paige felt she had no other options and had to turn to a riskier profession in order to provide for her kids.